All right, let's get started. My name is Adam Costo, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the Department of History at Columbia University. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this event celebrating the publication of At the Center, American Thought and Culture in the 20th Century. This is part of an ongoing series of events organized by the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University to recognize new work by faculty in the arts and sciences. We'd also like to recognize the support of the divisional deans, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, the Society of Fellows, and if it's not a conflict of interest, to thank myself, the Department of History. My first role as MC is to introduce the panelists. I've been given 180 seconds to do this, and I've used up 30 of them, which leaves me about 25 seconds each for our 6 panelists. So I'm just going to get on with it. So our first speakers are going to be the co-authors of the book. First, Casey Blake, who's professor of history, Mendelssohn Family Professor of American Studies, and the director of the Center for American Studies at Columbia University. He'll be followed by Daniel Boris, who's professor emeritus of history at the University of Rochester, and then Howard Brick, who's Lewis Evans Professor of History at the University of Michigan. All three, naturally, are specialists in 20th century American culture. They will speak together for 15 to 18 minutes or so. And then we will have the 3 respondents, each of whom will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. First, we'll have Alma Steingart, Assistant Professor of History at Columbia University. She's a specialist in US political and intellectual history, and for the present purposes, author of the forthcoming book, Pure Abstraction, Mathematical Thought and High Modernism. Next, Roz Posnock, who's Anna S. Barbadian Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia. He's a specialist in 20th century literature. And finally, James Kloppenberg, Charles Warren Professor of American History at Harvard University and a specialist in modern intellectual history in Europe and the US. After all of that, I will give the authors an opportunity to respond to comments. And then if everyone sticks to time, we should have 15 minutes or so for audience questions. You're instructed to post your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll do my best to coordinate that. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Casey.
Thank you, Adam. And thanks to everyone at ISERP and the Heyman Center for organizing this event. The title of our book speaks to the concerns that animated this collaboration. On the most prosaic level, it refers to our chronological period, the center of the 20th century, and more specifically to the years between 1948 and 1963, the time of the high Cold War and the apex of US global hegemony. That period witnessed a growing confidence among political and cultural leaders that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the US stood at the center of things. As Columbia historian Jacques Barzun observed in 1952, the US after the war was now quite simply the world power, which means the center of world awareness. Such confidence coexisted with an undertow of dread, with the cultural and intellectual life of the country haunted by the global slaughter of the early 1940s and the possibility of worse destruction to come. Such fears generated many of the centering projects that occupy our attention, efforts to locate moral and epistemological principles that might guide human conduct, to chart pathways to psychological maturity, and to promote a humanism that would allow for the inclusion of marginalized groups and solidarity across national borders. In contrast to the historicism and pragmatism of the early 20th century, our period witnessed a new foundationalism, which in turn marked it off from the second revolt against formalism that came to the fore amid the conflicts of the late 60s and 70s. It should be noted that we have not written a history of what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the vital center of American politics, though his brief for anti-communist liberalism gets its due in our book. Nor have we recycled a story about Cold War consensus, even as we note the yearning for consensus in some quarters. Our long 50s is not what the poet Robert Lowell called the tranquilized 50s. What makes the period distinctive in our view is the search for centers and the recoil against such centering. That dynamic, not any imagined consensus, is what we find at the center of the 20th century. The era's centering impulse had a strong anti-historicist character, unusual in being self-conscious about its own historicity. The horrors of contemporary history, many argued, demanded a turn away from history understood as a story of progress. Albert Camus signaled this shift in his 1946 essay, Neither Victims Nor Executioners, which was immediately translated into English by the American radical critic Dwight MacDonald. We cannot escape history since we are in it up to our necks, Camus wrote, but one may propose to fight within history to preserve from history that part of man which is not its proper province. That fight was taken up by US thinkers ranging from MacDonald on the anarchist left to Richard Weaver on the traditionalist right, as well as leading figures in the philosophy of science, anthropology, social psychology, Zen Buddhism, and Christian theology. This was, to be sure, not Fukuyama's end of history, but an effort to safeguard meaning and purpose in an age of authoritarianism and total war. Yet anti-historicism and the quest to center human experience generated fierce opposition, again creating unwitting alliances between figures who are rarely considered together. Cultural critic Kenneth Burke and advocates of modernization theory maintained a historicist worldview, as of course did practicing historians. The search for a stable self, secure against the forces of social control, coexisted with anxiety about loneliness as a paralyzing feature of modern existence, manifest in David Reisman's classic, The Lonely Crowd, and Frank Sinatra's ballads alike. The new critics in literature and Clement Greenberg in the visual arts sought to fix the meaning of modernist works in their formal properties. They faced a sharp rebuke from the relational aesthetics pioneered at Black Mountain College, the new American poetry movements in San Francisco and New York, and the happenings of the late 50s and early 60s. These new modernists abandoned the autonomous art object for art as performance, fractured audience perspective, and sought to erase the boundary between art and real life. The era's assimilationist projects likewise faced challenges from many quarters, notably from Black artists and intellectuals like Lorraine Hansberry, Miles Davis, Nina Simone, James Baldwin, and Amiri Baraka, but also from informal assertions of difference, such as the turnout of gay men for Judy Garland's 1961 comeback concert at Carnegie Hall, and the struggle of political elites to maintain the country's place at the center of world awareness suffered one shock after another from anti-colonialist movements across the globe. History could not be banished, in other words, and by 1963, history returned with a vengeance in Birmingham, in Dallas, and in Vietnam. Americans have ever since lived on edge.
Thank you to Columbia University, and thank you, Casey. The new foundationalism was especially in evidence in thinking about the interplay of self and society. The self assumed new importance in light of an understanding that totalitarianism had triumphed because it exploited the unfulfilled psychic needs of individuals enmeshed in a mass society. Interestingly, the post-war search for a continuous stable self was conducted primarily as a psychological one, rather than, as in the past, one more suited for philosophy or religion. A significant aspect of the search for self was rooting selfhood in biology. William Sheldon's somatotypes that link personality with body type, Alfred Kinsey's naturalistic study of human sexual behavior, Margaret Mead's meditation on sexual and gender differences, and Orthodox Freudianism all anchored the self in a biological foundation, a position that did not, of course, go unchallenged. Complementing the post-war nature-nurture debate was a related one, whether the Self in America was so pressed in by others that it lost its autonomy, or whether it lacked real and meaningful attachments. That played out in a culture-wide interest in loneliness, which subtly changed in meaning from the feeling that arose when physically alone to feelings that arose from insufficient or unrewarding connections. Here we examine how cultural artifacts from David Reisman's Lonely Crowd, such Westerns as High Noon, Shame, and The Lonely Are the Brave, George Tooker's paintings, Robert Frank's photographs in The Americans, and Frank Sinatra's singing, all put loneliness at the center of their work. Both biological change and social insecurities converged in adolescence. Negotiating those changes, as Erik Erikson noted in his famed Childhood and Society, made adolescence a pivotal stage. How American teenagers would develop prompted reports from the field by, among others, sociologist James Coleman, professor of education Edgar Z. Friedenberg, and cultural anthropologist Jules Henry. It prompted a slew of movies for and about teenagers, the most famous being Rebel Without a Cause, which saw the teenage problem as a lack of strong male role models. And of course, a set of classic novels, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye and Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar. Viewed from the vantage of society writ large, many analysts discern convergence of previously opposed entities and celebrated acceptance of formerly excluded groups on relatively equal grounds. Princeton economist Richard Lester and the authors of Fortune's USA, The Permanent Revolution, noted that workers were more likely to view themselves as consumers and regard themselves as part of a broad middle class. Likewise, sociologist Will Herberg took note of the decline of ancestral identities and the growing acceptance of Catholics and Jews, primarily because the three main faiths had lost their theological precision. Although studies then and since have questioned the degree to which ethnics Americanized, the changes provided stark contrast with the 19th century. Racial exclusion, of course, remained the one glaring exception, but Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan regarded it as irrational, bound to disappear when people of color adopted mainstream cultural patterns. Hastening the process, Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal and associates wrote in American Dilemma, would be the recognition that exclusion violated central American values. Excluded, however, well knew inclusion would not happen without struggle. Many of the challenges to exclusion depended on the belief that the excluded differed from those at the center of power and privilege in only superficial ways. The famous Brown versus Board of Education argued that the psychological harm that resulted from the separation of the races, rather than innate differences, accounted for disparities in educational achievements. A similar emphasis appeared in Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, which strongly rejected longstanding notions of female biological inferiority and insisted women were entitled to a full human identity, did not restrict their goals. For their part, gay Americans could point to the path-breaking work of Evelyn Hooker that conclusively demonstrated there existed no psychological or mental differences between gay and straight. Although the tendency of the era was to favor integration on the grounds of fundamental similarity, voices ranging from Lorraine Hansberry to feminist Eve Merriam to Donald Webster Corey, author of This Homosexual in America, warned that inclusion ran the risk of erasing differences that served as valuable resources for Blacks, women, and gays, respectively. That position would become much more pronounced in subsequent years.
Thanks, Dan and Casey, and thanks to the sponsors, the host, and the commentators for being here all together tonight. This book belongs to a series founded over 30 years ago by Lewis Perry, distinguished historian of American thought and culture, the author of Radical Abolitionism, Anarchy and the Government of God and Anti-Slavery Thought, that's of 1973, Civil Disobedience, an American Tradition of 2013, and his own synoptic treatment, Intellectual Life in America, A History, in 1984. With At the Center, this series of 15 volumes treating successive periods from 16th to early 21st centuries is now complete. And we thereby dedicate this volume to Lou. The nature of these volumes require authors to work a kind of trick, devising a theme or argument neither too restrictive as to force a wide range of phenomena into a narrow mold, nor so broad as to be bland, indefinite, uninformative. Insofar as we managed to pull off that trick, we three believe the result stems from a rich collaboration whereby we interactively shape the chapters, their topics, their arrangement, and the guiding purpose throughout. Our discipline's general reliance on periodization is, I suppose, a hallmark of what's called historicism. But I also have sympathy for the anti-historicism of Dipesh Chakrabarty, whose notion of braided histories denies the possibility of a clean cross-section, if you will, of a historical moment. That is what Daniel Bell, in a rather different vein, used to cite with mocking scorn as zeitgeist. So our theme disclaims the attempt to fix a single character on this time, but rather identifies a thought style, which we call centering, which itself expressed itself in variegated ways and coexisted with any number of countercurrents. And our period is not the 50s, certainly not as an opposite or prelude to the 60s, but rather what we see as a span of time that has a degree of definition, but also fluid boundaries. We end the book focusing on the last years of our span with a discussion of three types of intellectual phenomena: culminations, revivals, and innovations. First, products typically imagine breaks toward 60s dispositions when in fact, they are just as much fulfillments of trends germinating through the mid-century period, such as Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. These are culminations. Second, some things present at the inception of our period, which had appeared to lapse for the duration, resurfaced at its end, such as the folk revival, a Black left's multiculturalism from Robeson to Belafonte, and even in some respects more visible gay communities. Revivals. Third, we see genuine innovations, such as a new Black arts movement evident already by 1960, such as the jazz secession of Charles Mingus et al. From the Newport Festival. Moreover, we rest our definition of the mid-century span less with a definite spirit of the time than on a world historical juncture, that is the height of US hegemony amid both Cold War and decolonization, and a structure of feeling associated with it that combined somewhat antithetical terms of equipoise and anxiety. The newly achieved overweening power of the United States in the world, without, of course, any sure centralized control of wide-ranging events, called forth a rather new degree of thinking globally in intellectual life. And while a good deal of that trend stemmed from a new regime of Cold War-inspired federal funding for scholarship, it also drew in a number of dissenters, overt or discreet, who sympathized with the worldwide decolonizing movements. When by the early 1960s, those movements abroad came to appear collectively as a mounting anti-colonial revolution, the veneer of the intellectual academic acceptance of Cold War policy started to crack and bring on, in the succeeding decades, a new and different academic scene. Here too, we might see a combination of revival and innovation. As early as 1952, the remarkable anthropologist Robert Redfield, a world federalist, ostensibly devoted to a centering disposition, remarked, quote, "It is not true, is it not true," he said, "is it not true that the individually led creativity in the moral order comes not from people who are in the center of the expanding civilization and who have the power, but from people who feel themselves outside it?" He noted, he said, that the East today is in revolt and, quote, "mankind is on the move again," thus prefiguring the claims made by more radical anthropologists Marshall Solins and Elman Service in 1960, when they welcomed what they called the awakening of once lowly and dominated peoples as a sign that horizons of historical change had reopened. Redfield's remarks of 1952 had already suggested in ways subtly challenging the mainstream modernization theory of his time that some off-centered force might play the role of instigating that renewal of change. Paradoxically, then, the widening of world affiliation in a universalist and centered mode could subtly give way to a decentering move, or at least a tendency to criticize the weight of US power at the center.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you.
And let's turn things over to our first respondent, Alma Steingart.
Thank you for this invitation. And I should say it's a great pleasure to take part in this celebration and to share the stage, or at least the virtual stage, with such esteemed colleagues. My only concern when sitting down to draft these comments was that regardless of how much I'll try, I will not be able to do justice to the richness of this book. Indeed, my strongest impression when reading the work was sheer awe at how masterfully Professor Blake, Professor Boris, and Professor Brick weave together seemingly disparate mid-century conversation into a sharply argued and holistic grand narrative of American thought and culture at mid-century. Indeed, the volumes succeed in being exhaustive without exhausting its reader, packing into a relatively slim volume an astonishingly diverse group of thinkers and artists. For example, in the book's introduction alone, the voices of sociologist C. Wright Mills and historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. harmonize with the poetry of W.H. Auden and Allen Ginsberg. At the center, focus on the 15 years between 1948 and 1963, the moment of equipoise after World War II has ended, but before the assassination of JFK, people's increasing disillusionment with the war in Vietnam, and the height of the civil rights movement. It is during this period that the author identified discernible disposition among American artists and thinkers towards what they describe as centeredness, meaning a shared desire to discover and establish fundamentals that are universal and stable. Concomitant with these sentiments, as you already heard, they argued that there was a rejection of history because intellectuals were more interested in that which endured and was fundamental to their experience than that which was changeable. The book, as I hope is obvious by now, covers much ground. So in the interest of time, I will focus my comments this evening on three questions that I was left with when reading the work. First, I ask how the book reflects on our contemporary moment. I will next offer another layer to the meaning of center in the work. Finally, I'll query the place of ideology in mid-century thought and culture. At the center is what the author described as an inclination towards centering that was shared by different disciplines and cultural expression. This shared style of thought, as they explain, emphasized universality, a search for essential principles, and foundational belief and a desire for synthesis. In some they wrote, and here I quote, rendering experience something stable, balanced, whole, and focus on commonly recognized realities. By now, it is somewhat a truism that historical writing is always socially, culturally, and politically situated. The historian might seek to understand the past, but she inevitably does so from her perch in the present and its webs of significances. And the same is inevitably true of her reader. Reading this book this week, in particular, the phrase and the quote, commonly recognized realities, caught me off balance. Indeed, just a few headlines that I skimmed in the past few days included phrases such as denial of reality, unstable reality, a surreal reality show, and the world's slacking grip on reality. Trumpian politics has shined a bright light on the fact that many Americans now inhabit incommensurable realities. When the New York Times' Maggie Haberman refers to Trump's claims of election fraud as performative art, it is painfully apparent that the lines demarcating truth from fiction are being withdrawn. What strikes me then is the amount of work required to producing a shared sense of experience and of insisting on a stable common ground. In other words, it takes both intellectual and artistic efforts to create and maintain a shared reality, or does it? One example of this is in the second chapter of the book, which details scholars and artists' occupation with the question of what makes American culture and American identity distinctly American. This is not to say that the author emphasized that there was ever any agreement about what American entailed. Rather, scholars, intellectuals, and artists were united in their shared conviction that seeking a shared foundation was a value in itself. For example, sociologist Talcott Persson argued that society is unified by a shared set of values, while literary critic Alfred Kazan explained that realism, by which he meant a need to learn what reality of life was, characterized American literature. In a telling episode, the Partisan Review published in 1952 a special issue entitled Our Country and Our Culture. While contributors disagree on much, most of them did not question that one can indeed speak of an American culture as such. As we all know, and became clear already, mid-century effort to define American identity operated through exclusionary logic. What, or rather, who scholars left out was just as telling and violent and who they included. In so doing, they helped produce what Ellen Brinkley termed the illusion of unity. So perhaps you might flip Brinkley's coinage to say that today's United States is plagued instead by a unity of illusion. Next, I want to press a bit on the meaning of the word center to ask to what degree was the intellectual inclination towards centering and decentering buttressed by physical centers, that is, places where thinkers and artists alike could congregate, think together, and share their experiences. Or put otherwise, what is the epistemic infrastructure of mid-century American thought? I mean this in the concrete sense of material and immaterial structure and networks that allow for the circulation of knowledge in people, including, but certainly not limited to institution. Here, what might include places like Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which was visited by Joseph Albers, John Cage, Maurice Cunningham, Buckminster Fuller, Franz Klein, and Clement Greenberg, and as the author makes clear in the book, many, many, many others. To what degree was the ability to experiment together on site crucial to the artistic endeavor of the time? But not just Black Mountain College, the Museum of Modern Art served as another crucial clearing for artistic and architectural work of the time. It curated famous exhibits such as the Exhibition House of Gregory Ain in 1950, Abstract Painting and Sculpture in America in 1951, and The Family of Men in 1955. Such artistic centers were matched, of course, by intellectual ones. University offices, centers, and laboratories function as what Joel Isaacs has termed the interstitial academy, those seminar and supper clubs where ideas are aired beyond the bounds of disciplinarity. And beyond the academy, other types of intellectual and social centers flourished in mid-century. New think tanks, such as RAND Corporation, served as an important locus for defense intellectuals who were able to move seamlessly between the university and the corridors of power in Pentagon. One such specimen was, of course, Herman Kahn, who was captured so astutely and with dark hilarity in Stanley Kubrick's 1963 Dr. Strangelove. And if you'll humor me, I'd like to stretch the notion of center a bit further to also include mid-century journals and magazines such as Life magazine and Time, which broadcast this conversation to a broader reading public. To what degree might the centering you describe depend on already existing centers? And what new epistemological infrastructure were designed and built during these years to sustain American thought and culture? Finally, I'd like to turn to the role of ideology in your story. Across the social sciences and the arts, historians have tried to ascertain whether a certain Cold War ideology might account for post-war intellectual life. In the art, Serge Guilbaut has famously argued that in insisting its art was apolitical, both the US government as well as the art world, artists, critics, collectors, used abstract expressionism to advance Cold War agendas. Frederick Jamison has argued that the modernist ideology in the arts, which both celebrated aesthetic autonomy and insisted that the art existed beyond politics and culture, was uniquely American, and this is a quote, American invention, end quote, a product of the Cold War. Historians often tout Clement Greenberg as the most obvious example of this ideology, but many other abstract expressionists ascribe to similar notions. So for example, during a symposium at MoMA in 1951, Robert Motherwell boldly stated, quote, "One of the most striking aspects of abstract art appearance is her nakedness, an art stripped bare, how many rejections on the part of her artist, whole worlds, the world of objects, the world of power and propaganda, the world of anecdotes, the world of fetishes and ancestor worship." Historians have similarly attended to the ideological underpinning of mid-century social and human sciences. Ted Porter diagnosed the turn toward disciplinary autonomy and the assertion of neutral objectivity during the Cold War as social scientists' effort to depoliticize knowledge production, which he referred to as putative ideology of no ideology. The narrative you offer, however, seems to suggest something somewhat a little bit different. The search for a shared foundation, ethical, universal, and a stable center is not so much an attempt to exist beyond politics or to insulate cultural and intellectual production from the horrors of war and anxieties of the nuclear world. Rather, perhaps it was a search for a shared reality that could withstand the politics of the moment. What sort of intellectual and creative capacity might this different orientation therefore afford? Thank you.
Thank you, Alla. Next up, Ross Posnock.
Great, thank you. Tonight, I'd like to speak about a book that at the center insightfully discusses David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd of 1950 and connected to a figure whom I think is as if waiting in the wings of that book, a figure whom at the center oddly neglects. I speak of Hugh Hefner, who in 1953 founded Playboy. And here, let me place a trigger warning. I'll be discussing Hefner as a more complicated figure than simply as a male chauvinist pig. The theme that concerns me is, quote, American sophistication, a phrase that risks sounding oxymoronic. Like cosmopolitan, sophistication is a fighting word in American culture, a word that discomfits, raises eyebrows. It's not who we are, to borrow a favorite locution of President Obama's, for it smacks of elitism. Whereas the first word has had a stormy modern history, Stalin, for instance, used cosmopolitan as a code word for Jew, sophistication has always kept bad company, starting with its etymology. Its first 6 letters saddle it with sophistry, both tarred with the same brush of suspicion. Sophistry was a form of rhetoric that attracted the enmity of Socrates and Plato, with repercussions deep into the 17th century and then far beyond. In the West, rhetoric, sophistry, and sophistication are arraigned as a shared locus of anti-nature, empty style, deceptive artifice, effeminate preening. The American social soil, which might have bred sophistication, is thin because it's a soil of Puritan-derived inner direction, the internal gyroscope, these are Reisman's famous phrases, the internal gyroscope keeping the male steady, keeping his own counsel, keeping focused on the task at hand. In The Lonely Crowd, Reisman speaks of, quote, the compulsory emotional constriction, the frightening coldness of many inner-directed Americans. Fortunately for the inner-directed type, or in part because of him, American society makes minimal social demands. Erich Fromm, in fact, the mentor of Reisman, defined sociality as, in effect, a niceness made compulsory and instrumental. He wrote, "You need to have a pleasing personality if you want to sell services, whether as a waitress, a salesman, or a physician. Only those at the bottom of the social pyramid who sell nothing but their physical labor, and those at the very top do not need to be particularly pleasant," noted Fromm in Escape from Freedom. This requirement to please, a demand exacerbated in bureaucratic institutions where impersonality is deodorized in pseudo-warmth by a soothing, quote, false personalization, is one spur initiating the perceived shift in the 20th century to what Reisman called the other-directed. Radar, responsiveness to others, replaces gyroscope in Reisman's famous typology. This shift replaces a 19th century world organized by production with consumption and leisure. As character is replaced by personality in Warren Sussman's analogous binary, qualities that the inner-directed had repressed come to the fore, quote, feminine qualities of sympathy and empathy. The other-directed are, says Reisman, more sensitive to the immediate social setting than inner-directed man, both more attuned to and tolerant of the feelings, wishes, and expectations of other people encountered in the diverse situations of daily life. In a 1961 preface, Reisman saluted this ideal type while noting that, quote, only a very small minority, sometimes people brought up in a puritanical milieu, have responded warmly to the values of other direction, its openness and lack of inhibition, its interest in others, and its readiness to change. The majority of Reisman's readers cast wary, even, quote, embarrassed eyes on this flagrant regard for others, this openness, too needy, too vulnerable. Reisman even admits, quote, it is hard for us to be quite fair to the other-directed. The term itself, he says, suggests shallowness and superficiality as compared to the inner-directed, even though direction in both cases comes from outside, end quote. Remarking that his depiction of the other-directed, quote, has come off a bad second in these pages, Reisman confesses a bias he cannot overcome, as if his book has a life of its own, not under his control. With its author unable or unwilling to give a dispassionate account of his ideal types, no wonder The Lonely Crowd was read as elegy for the heroic inner-directed. The nostalgic response to The Lonely Crowd should be understood as a way to protect the fortress of male individualism from open-ended, other-directed forms of sociability, forms that make possible sophisticated behavior, which inevitably requires an audience. Such other-directness tends to foment hostility and suspicion, and not only in America. For instance, think of Restoration London fops on stage, for instance, in George Etheredge's The Man of Mode. The main character, Sir Fopling Flutter, made moralists uneasy. For these sophisticates, called then exquisites or dandies, esteemed appearance over reality, seemed all outside and no inside, and preferred the company of women. Sir Fopling is a ladies' man, a type redefined as the swinging bachelor about town by the 1950s exemplar of other direction, Hugh Hefner, the most influential purveyor of 20th century packaged sophistication. If the fop induced male anxiety about feminization, the Hefner playboy's exuberant virility soothed it. But at the same time, he also integrated the feminine with the masculine, turning the American male into an urban sophisticate, as he noted in the first issue's editorial introducing the magazine. It meant weaning him from the outdoors, from the manly Hemingway figure rambling among field and stream, and domesticating him. Hence, Hefner states in the editorial, his first editorial, "We like our apartment," marking his territory. And there he will acquire interest and ease. Hefner's subscriber, his reader, will acquire interest and ease with, quote, traditionally feminine pastimes of fashion, cooking, and decoration, as a historian of Playboy has written. And this includes as well serious conversation As Hefner writes, we enjoy putting a little mood music on the phonograph and inviting in a female for a quaint discussion of Picasso, Nietzsche, jazz, and sex, end quote. This is again in the editorial. Hefner's Playboy, the magazine, building upon the first men's magazine, Esquire, of 1933, anticipates by half a century the, quote, metrosexual movement, the metrosexual moment that America stood on the verge of. These are the words of the New York Times announcing this momentous thing in 2003, announcing it with impeccable historical ignorance. They report the imminent TV debut of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, in which a team, this is their words, a team of 5 gay men transform a style-deficient and culture-deprived straight man from drab to fab, end quote. The metrosexual, the Times tells us, possesses a, quote, carefree attitude toward the inevitable suspicion that a man who dresses well, has good manners, understands thread counts, or has opinions on women's fashion is gay. It would be hard to find more vivid testimony of how enduring is American sophistication's threat to the conventionally masculine. In 2003, the, quote, inevitable suspicion surrounding the coming out of the metrosexual expresses a barely sublimated homosexual panic about something as anodyne as, quote, straight urban men willing, even eager to embrace their feminine sides, which to glean from the Times article amounts to little more than buying Clinique products and haricot vert rather than green beans. Compared to the harassed, anxious pressure exerted upon the 21st century metrosexual, the calm sophistication of Hefner's 50s Playboy is clear. Even in a decade of national homophobia, Hefner managed to, quote, push the boundaries of acceptable heterosexual male behavior, quoting from Carrie Pizzulo's book. Hefner softens traditionally hard-edged American masculinity, an achievement even Gloria Steinem noted. In a 1970 conversation, she told Hefner, you're partly responsible for women's lib in a way. You've supplanted brute strength as a symbol of maleness with sports cars and appliances. If men don't play the warrior role, women don't have to play their mother of warrior roles, remarked Steinem. Turning the other directed from frantic glad-handing to smooth urbanity was an achievement that should have impressed Reisman. Yet sophistication, and Hefner, of course, is a missing term in Reisman's typology, but he is present in embryo on the edges of The Lonely Crowd. His magazine debuted 3 years after the book appeared. Near the end of Lonely Crowd, Reisman speaks of, quote, the speed with which the gradient of taste is being climbed in the popular arts and on the level of jazz connoisseurship. Reisman, in effect, sets the stage for the full flowering that would occur over the course of the decade. Sophistication as a mode in itself, whether called cool or hip, would flourish in music, politics, humor, and entertainment. Recall the late 50s Sinatra and his Rat Pack with their JFK affiliation courtesy of his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, but also his turn to melancholy inwardness so richly evoked in At the Center. Recall Lena Horne and Eartha Kitt, supper club chanteuses and occasional actors, each with a sophisticated cool, Kitt pushing hers to the satirical limit. Recall Miles Davis playing his trumpet with his back to the audience, his advertised indifference, part of his instantly iconic cool refusal to be an ingratiating entertainer. Recall the rise of cutting-edge political and cultural satirists such as Jules Feiffer, Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, Mike Nichols, and Elaine May. Nearly all were published in Playboy, and all were embraced by the intelligentsia before and especially during the culturally glamorous years of the Kennedy White House. An unapologetic sophistication at last. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And then finally, Jim Kloppenberg.
Thank you all for inviting me, and thanks to Casey, Howie, and Dan for writing such a wonderful book. I think often we in the academy underplay the significance or the difficulty of syntheses of this sort, and this is an extremely fine piece of work. I'm not going to go into detail because I've written a review of the book, and those of you who want to see it can stand by because it'll appear in the Journal of American History in one of the forthcoming issues. I wish that this book had existed back in the 1970s when Rob Westbrook, Michael Kazin, and I were trying to make sense of American intellectual history. This is exactly the sort of book that will help students do that, and that will send scholars scurrying back to the primary sources, which I think is exactly what intellectual historians ought to do. So thank you for producing this book. It will be of great value for decades to come. I want to say a little bit about an issue that Alma Steingart raised, and that is the contemporary issues that the book makes me think of as I reread it in the last few days. Do we have any centering in 2020? If we don't, what are the costs of the absence of any aspiration to centering? A number of people who've written about the polarization in American politics recently have pointed out that the conservative movement from the 60s to the present has become the Republican Party, whereas the Democratic Party remains a coalition of disparate groups that have little in common and can't seem to agree about much of anything. Contrast the moment that is described and examined in At the Center. In 1955, at the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Daniel Bell announced the end of ideology. He thought that the liberal democratic welfare state marked the end of any aspiration toward either Marx or Hayek, let alone Hitler or Stalin. But as At the Center points out, that moment didn't endure. Instead, change occurred. But a change occurred in the United States before that liberal democratic welfare state could be fully established, as it was fully established in Northern Europe. And I would argue that we've been the poorer for it ever since. Now that we understand, now that we understand the underside of pluralism, as it was seen by those who interpreted and celebrated Tocqueville and James Madison, now that we understand the undersides of the pluralism of Robert Dahl, and we see the exclusions that were part of At the Center, what have we lost? To restate the question I asked at the beginning. Do we have any shared ideals that can bring us together, or are we fated to endure ever more bitter polarization of the sort that we saw played out in the election, and that we seem almost certain to see play out in the next 2, perhaps the next 4 years? So that's the first question. The second question has to do with the point that Casey made to begin with, that this was a period that saw a move away from anti-foundationalism and away from pragmatism and toward a kind of formalism and toward a quest for the universal. And yet, toward the end of the book, the last couple chapters of the book deal with the greeting between the meeting of pragmatism and modernism at Black Mountain and elsewhere, in the architecture of Louis Kahn, in the happenings of Alan Kaprow, of the history of science of Thomas Kuhn. So is it possible that even at the height of an aspiration for universalism, we saw the early moments that would lead into the anti-foundationalism of the late 20th century? And if there is a way to move past the fragmentation that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years in American culture, is pragmatism the vehicle for that aspiration toward another kind of, if not synthesis or unity, at least an aspiration to something at the center? The final comment that I will make before I turn it over to a Q&A is that canon building, our authors point out, is a centering exercise. And I'm wondering, since most of us here are at Columbia, whether canon building remains at Columbia in the Contemporary Civilizations program an exercise in moving toward the center, or if it has become a different kind of exercise at Columbia, as it has become in so many other universities, such as my own, which find it impossible to come up with any curriculum that we think all of our students ought to become familiar with.
Thanks, Jim. So why don't the three authors unmute themselves, and if they can respond as they wish to the respondents. And those of you in the audience, you can start putting questions as they come to you in the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A, click on that and you should be able to enter your questions. So, authors.
Just briefly, I don't know why we didn't include Hefner. If that is a gap, something missing, but I can't recall why we didn't include him. I'll take the blame for it.
Well, I'll say a few words. First of all, thank you for these extraordinarily rich and generous comments. They're so perceptive and also so wide-ranging. I don't think that we three can possibly do justice to them in the time that we have. I note that both Amma and Jim sort of asked questions about our contemporary moment and the implications of this study for thinking about our contemporary moment. You know, I don't think historians are very good at being prophets, and so I'm not going to suggest how some of the issues that Jim especially raised might be resolved. What I will say, just in terms of thinking about our project, is that we chose to approach this period, I think, with a different spirit or a different sensibility than have some recent scholars of the mid-century. And sorry to name names, but I think of Mark Greif, among others, who I think have treated the period with a certain condescension. We wanted to take seriously the universalist and foundationalist aspirations of the period and try to understand historically their situation, their provenance, and then their trajectory. I think that Amma raises really some terrific questions about the institutional infrastructure for the intellectual and cultural currents that we discuss. And we probably gave that inconsistent attention, I suppose, in the book. But we are concerned in the book with sites of artistic production and knowledge production, whether area studies or a place like Black Mountain College or the club, the 8th Street Club, or the architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania. These are important to our work. I think to have given each and all of these sites the kind of full attention that they perhaps deserve would have taken us in a different direction. On the issue of ideology, and I'm sure Howie has a lot to say here, but I'll just say that I think that at least in terms of our discussion of the arts, we wanted to push back somewhat against what I at least consider a kind of tendentious narrative about modernism, most tendentious in the case of someone like Serge Guilbaut. There are more sophisticated versions out there. And frankly, tell a different story about post-war modernism in the US. And I think that as much as it's important to understand the extent to which the production, exhibition, and publicizing of modern art and architecture were processes all implicated in the institutional arrangements of the post-war period, they deserve some close attention in their own right, and the sort of aesthetic impulses at work deserve attention of a kind that I'm not sure they've always received in some of the more political accounts of these movements. Howard, I don't know.
Howard, did you want to weigh in? Or? Howard is now frozen.
Yes, I'm sorry, at least on my end, things are breaking up somewhat. So I'm not sure I heard all of Casey's remarks. Yes, indeed, thanks to all the commentators for very provocative arguments and queries. And it's hard to know where to start in responding to them. I definitely want to second Casey's argument regarding modernism, that we very pointedly wanted to move away from the kind of reductionism that would view so many of the features of thought and culture at this time as mere reflexes of the Great American Celebration, or of Cold War anti-communism, or the ubiquity of the image of containment and so forth. We definitely wanted to get away from that kind of thing, and that applies also to our treatments of academic trends, as I tried to suggest in my introductory remarks on the nature of the beginning global thinking globally. I noticed in the question and answer that there box, there was already a question regarding the politics of centering. And in fact, part of our purpose was also to suggest that what we call centering does not necessarily have a definite political bent. The assumption, especially among, well, with the rise of postmodernism in the 70s and 80s, that the centering of so-called liberal humanism was by nature a conservative impulse. And our argument is thinking of someone like Dwight MacDonald, who epitomizes centering when he says the root is man, disallows that kind of political reductionism. On the other hand, we didn't seek to avoid or evade politics throughout. On the question of how what we say about the contemporary moment, it's very difficult. You could read it in two different ways. Obviously, the fragmentation and the fictive realities in which we see various constituencies living was, of course, precisely what Hannah Arendt was challenging. The whole notion of ideology in her view was precisely the creation of these all-enveloping fictive realities. The other side of it, however, and indeed, when we look at the present, you could say that fragmentation is something fearsome. On the other hand, what would one make of MAGA if not a coercive centering impulse of the worst sort? So many of these things could be read variously. I think I'll leave it at that. On Hefner, all we could say is this is a Doe moment.
May I just add a couple of things here? Ross's comments are characteristically so suggestive, no pun intended in reference to Hefner here. But as in thinking about the debates about the self, introducing the concept of sophistication, I think in important ways shifts the discussion even away from Reisman's own terms of analysis. And one starts to think about, I'm thinking out loud here, but you and I have talked about your project. One thinks about figures like the sort of great African-American jazz artists, or a figure like Baldwin, as embodying a certain kind of African-American sophistication, right, that comes to the fore and is highly controversial in the middle years of the 20th century. I actually, if I just might add a bit more in response to the question that Jim raised, I guess that Amma raised, not in the form of an answer to our current predicament, but just an observation. What's striking to me as I hear the two of you talk is that whatever search for a center people might want to embark on now seems to be a response to a fracturing of the public sphere. Whereas I think that perhaps back in the late 1940s, the search for a center was motivated not so much by a fear of fracturing, but a fear of new forms of domination, of totalitarian control. And so a search for some stable sense of self or stable human essence as a form of resistance. But your comments, especially Jim, suggest that if people are looking for a center today, it's perhaps for other reasons.
Daniel, do you want to
No.
word it edgewise here?
No, my co-authors have answered for me.
All right. Well, we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A. And again, I encourage those of you in the audience to type those in there. And if you can't find the Q&A, it's not clear to me how you would communicate with me and tell me that. So find the Q&A. So I think one of the first questions was already sort of referred to. Is there a political program in centering? Politicians, including Biden and Eisenhower, often talk about unity and bringing us together. Does this make any sense, or is centering more an analytical category that doesn't translate into politics? I think you've already hinted at some answers to that, but does anyone want to pick up further on that? Jim, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, since I raised the question, let me just be a little bit clearer. I think what has happened since the insurgents that you talk about in the book came to a kind of maturity in the 60s, especially in the late 60s. What we on the left have suffered from is a fear of the center and a fear of coalitions, because we fear the loss of purity. And there's a new book by Robert Putnam and Shailin Romney Garrett called The Upswing, in which they make the case that what made progressivism and the New Deal and the Great Society possible was the willingness of reformers to form coalitions. And beginning in the late 60s into our own day, we haven't seen as much of that. People have retreated into themselves. And what I think we've lost is a sense of civic engagement. And that was so powerful in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. I think it was still powerful in the period that you write about in At the Center. And I do worry really that we on the left have been our own worst enemies, because we've been so intent on paying attention to each particular group in the United States that we've lost the awareness that you have to get to 51 to make anything happen in the United States. And that unless you aggregate those groups, you remain a collection of powerless minorities. And I worry that we're in the danger of becoming another collection of powerless minorities by our unwillingness to sign on to anything that a centrist like Joe Biden might propose.
Okay, another question here. In the 1950s, sociology was sometimes called the queen of the social sciences. It had a precipitous fall in later decades to a degree because it was denoted as, quote, white sociology. Does this fit into your schema?
Well, to be sure, sociology in the 50s was a paramount form of centering, if you will. Obviously, Alma referred to our discussion of Parsons and shared values and, of course, functionalism generally of capturing the integrative forces that make up as such. And always it had a bent, attracting a lot of the young leftists of the 40s who entered the academy and did not by any means entirely desert their prior orientations. Many did, but by no means all. Yes, sociology thereafter suffered a fall, which was often noted in the 1970s, but by the 1980s, the discipline seemed to have recovered sufficiently well and remains actually academically rather robust in terms of what I see at my institution. I don't know if that answers the question. But let me add to this in reference to Alma's original comments about infrastructures and centers. Simply the growth of the modern research university, in fact, it's burgeoning after World War II, was such a physical infrastructure of centering, precisely in what was believed of the modern disciplines. So it's in this period you have, if you remember these huge compendia, the golden age of American anthropology, which was referring to the early 20th century, the Boasians, but it was issued in the 1950s. Of course, Parsons' sociology was based on this conviction of maturation of the discipline. It doesn't quite stand as such a queen of the social sciences. One might suggest that, well, as I've argued in another book, Parsons firmly believed that the rise of sociology had displaced the so-called old social sciences of economics and politics, political science, and a large part, as Dana Rogers points out in The Age of Fracture, that has since then is the the free market imperialism of a resurgence of methodological which indeed eats away and evacuates a sense of precisely that Parsons' brothers, Robin and so forth, assumed at the time.
I had a thought on sociology as well as I was listening and reading. Is that the political and the artistic connections seem pretty self-conscious in this period. Is the same true of, and of course, like social science and political is self-consciously connected, but are the social sciences and the arts connected in the same ways? They're that same sort of self-consciousness. You mentioned Rebel Without a Cause, but did they know in writing Rebel Without a Cause that they were commenting on contemporary sociological literature in that way? Naive question.
The book is from which the screenplay was taken was by a psychiatrist, right? Lindner, Robert Lindner, who also did the 50-Minute Hour. So there, in that sense, I suppose there was that kind of recognition. Much of the, I don't know if some of the Rebel Without a Cause happened before some of the classic sociology on adolescence. So it's in some ways anticipatory.
As a comment from Susan Peterson, I do not think the problem is, quote, the left's failure to aggregate so much so as to create a center. I think the problem is that we are now at the mercy of new modes of communication that fragment the public and aggregate on the basis of shared, often extreme views. The quote, public sphere is dead, and this is a consequence not of our poor arguments, but of new technologies. I would be curious to know whether this is an issue of concern to the panel. I worry that we are not in the same world in which intellectuals of our sort mattered anymore. Discuss. Unmute and then discuss.
Can you give,
it is, I think, it is clear go ahead, Howard. Okay. Well, I disagree, Susan. I think that's one factor among 20 that have led to this fragmentation and the hollowing out of the center. But I think we've had a generation of scholarship that has been devoted to debunking the concerns that emerged quite understandably, as Casey pointed out, in the aftermath of totalitarianism. And we see totalitarians under every rock. And I think as a result of that, we're all too willing to dismiss anything from the center left to the center right as temporizing. Whereas what I found interesting about At the Center was the attempt to take seriously, to treat respectfully people who were looking for, as Bell was, a social democratic way forward that would preserve the best of liberal democracy, but would push it into the late 20th century in a way that would bring in those who had been excluded both by race and gender and by poverty. And I think what has happened to us is that we're so concerned with each particular group that we've neglected to acknowledge that everyone suffers when we allow those who agree on the right to engage in this fantasy of a laissez-faire free market capitalism. And we've all been, we as privileged academics, but the American people have been paying a tremendous price because of the failure of the left to unite. And I think the time has come for us to stop fragmenting and to do what people like Bell and people whom we've condescended to for over half a century were trying to do. And that is to make social democracy work in the United States, as it's worked very well in Northern Europe up until fairly recently.
Howard?
Yeah, I would disagree somewhat with Jim's view on this. Though I would like it to be clear in my own work that I would never condescend to Daniel Bell, but I've learned enormously from him, including my reference to his anti-historicism, which continues to echo in my mind from talks I had with him. But two things here. You know, to a certain extent, Bell's work was so variegated and to a certain extent ambiguous that the end of ideology didn't only mean the appeal of a new center, but it also meant, as the subtitle of his famous book put it, the exhaustion of political ideas, where he was from even that point worried about what you're suggesting, a loss of a center, at least in the question he considered enduring. What holds a society together, and do we have the means to understand that? That was an open question for him. But the other side of it is that, unfortunately, I think that generation of social democratic liberals also bear some responsibility for our losses since. That is, the assumption they bore was that indeed the social democratic welfare state was a fixed feature of modernity. It was an ascendant feature of a modern democracy. It had really set aside prior oppositions, with the result that, well, to a certain extent, there was an underestimation of the order that could nurture right. For instance, a funny remark that Robert Solow made at a birthday celebration for Bell sometime in the late 90s, I believe, where Solow joked that, well, Bell wrote The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, which I and others have argued was, in fact, a social democratic liberal vision. And Solow said, we really have to recognize the going of post-industrial society as, in many respects, a failed assumption of a given trajectory.
So 717 seems to be the time when questions explode. We now have lots of questions in here, and I will try to pull out interesting ones. Universities like Columbia were committed in the 1950s to what we call today a core curriculum. And this goes to a point that Jim was making. To what extent was the deliberate attempt to create a cosmopolitan elite in a world in which the US had recently come to assume new international responsibilities a thread that ties together your narrative? So to what extent was the deliberate attempt to create a cosmopolitan elite a thread that ties together your narrative?
Oh, I think it was a quite conscious one. Yeah. The creation of canons had that effect, I think. And there was a certain cosmopolitanism that rang through much of the centering impulse, in large measure, I think, because of the new international prominence of the United States. So I would concur.
And again, I think this may have been addressed in part, but to what extent is the search for a center a means of forfending against the horrors of the world wars, a way to unmake the failures of the 1930s, even while the increasing threat of total war or global conflict remained present and anxiety inducing? I think what's been said already is that this was a reaction to totalitarianism per se, but this question is focusing on just the violence of war rather than the politics of totalitarianism. Casey?
Excuse me. Yes, exactly. I mean, that is one important theme in the book, that total war and slaughter on an unprecedented scale haunted the imagination of intellectuals and artists of really all stripes during this period. And I think it is one of the distinctive features of the era. There had, of course, always for some time been debates about individual wars, right? But now the idea of war on an unprecedented scale with the possibility, maybe even likelihood, of a far more destructive war on the horizon really is one of the defining features of the period. And actually, if you don't mind, that leads to something I wanted to say in response perhaps to Jim's comments about centering and the contemporary moment. I don't think one wants to identify the centering impulse of the post-war period entirely with the kind of social democratic project that someone like Daniel Bell was involved in. The search for centers of one kind or another occupied conservatives like Leo Strauss and Richard Weaver and Eric Vogelin. It occupied not only a radical like Dwight MacDonald, but anarcho-pacifists, and they are an important presence in our book, and the radical humanists with a sort of existentialist tinge who launched Liberation magazine in the middle years of the decade. So, I mean, what strikes me as I think about your comments is that there was a kind of discursive field in the period that we're examining in which the search for centers united people of very different ideological coloration. But then the question is, what does it mean for our own time that people across the ideological spectrum seem entirely to have given up that search? But again, I wouldn't want to suggest that the centering impulse of the period was entirely defined by a kind of end of ideology, liberal social democratic position.
I concur.
Sorry, go ahead, Howard.
I concur. I just want to second that indeed that was a large part of our point.
There's an appropriate final question in here because it's talking about ending points. So why 1963 in particular? I think of 1965 as such a social, political, and cultural pivot in standard accounts of the 1960s, suggesting a cohesion to the early part of the 1960s. Why exclude the work of the center of the 1960s before the bottom fell out? That's a historian's question.
You got to stop somewhere. But, you know, our point was not that the bottom fell out. And that's not quite the point. You know, we see what we call a phase change in which an intellectual tendency to decenter gains more sway sometime after the period we're talking about. We certainly didn't mean to make 1963 a hard and fast divider, though I think, you know, in my mind, when you think of Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam and the repudiation of a notion of that America is something that really offers a peaceful community as a grand lie, that's significant. And of course, that didn't mean that she or voices like that were urging the bottom to fall out. You know, they of course had other notions of social justice and equality to motivate them further. So actually, I would go further and say that our adoption of the theme of centering as characteristic of that period does not mean that that what came after was the unraveling of America. However we understand the kind of vicious sentiments that we see among us right now. So it's my view actually that even the late 60s certainly reinvigorated a great deal of militant protest. Actually, and here we go back to Parsons again, for better or worse. And, you know, society showed a good deal of resilience. People kept going to school. We entered the academy and so forth.
So, all right, well, we've come to the end of our time. So everyone, in whatever way is possible, please join me in thanking the authors and the respondents for what's been a wonderful panel. Thank you to the Heyman Center for hosting and the technical people behind the scenes. And we will bring things to a close. Thank you very much.